Hi folks, sketch number 3 then, and this one is a nice old rustic doorway. Loads and loads of photographs of doorways on the likes of Pixabay and Unsplash. I could have gone with one of any number. I like this one because of the nice blue woodwork, nice contrast with the kind of neutral colours of the brick and the rendering around the edges. Loads and loads of textures that we can get stuck into here. For this sketch, we're just going to give a quick loose impression of them. But if I wanted to take this on to a more detailed study, there's loads of textures and colours that we can get stuck into. I like as well the way there's some kind of colours within the brickwork. They're only quite subtle. So you've got some blues here, maybe greens, bit of blue there, maybe a little bit of red around there. We can play about with those, maybe get a little bit bolder, experiment a little bit. No worries about messing it up. If it doesn't work, no problem. Some other things to consider, this doorway isn't actually looking straight onto us, it's on a bit of an angle, and you can see that just with, if I point it out with a pen, you've got a bit of a slope here on the bottom, so all of our horizontals are kind of sloping just off. If that was bang on horizontal, there's a little bit of a slope to them, and what that means is that we can see the inside of this particular pillar here, we can see the inside of it. There's a little bit of perspective going on there. If I just point that out, zoom in again. So we've got this line at the bottom is quite a steep angle, and then gradually that angle decreases until this one here is almost horizontal, and this one as well. If there were any up at the top here, they'd be sloping inwards. It's a small detail, but it's just something to consider. This pillar, obviously we can't see the inside of that. There's also a little bit of perspective going on with the cobbles and the stonework at the bottom. So you've got a sharp angle here that gradually decreases in its angle till it's almost vertically down there. So we can give a little impression of that again. I'm definitely going to look to get a centre line in for the doorway quite early. We can extend that line up, is going to help us to draw the archway with a little bit more symmetry, because that potentially could be a little bit tricky. And while proportions in this are nowhere near as important as they would be for, drawing a figure or a portrait or something like that, I think it's still important to consider the overall proportion of the door frame. That's what I'll be looking at first. So the width relative to the height. And then we can look at some of the bigger shapes within the door frame. So this top rectangle here, and then maybe this area here, this one, and these down here, before you start to then put in individual lines for the thicknesses of the wood, the various different features of the architrave around that doorway. Still relatively simple as a subject and as a piece of architecture, definitely compared to the 3 or 4 that are coming up next. Potentially a few little things that could trip us up, but I think this is one that we should just get on and make a start with. Very quickly then, before I start, I've turned the paper from a landscape orientation to a portrait orientation, and that's not because the doorway is long and slim, that's because of my inability to sketch small enough in the first 2 studies. They were a little bit too big. So what I'm going to do is the next study in the top half, and then the sketch after that we do in the next part we'll do in the bottom half. And this is actually what I'd do if I was urban sketching and sketching outdoors. Typically we'll get 2 studies per page of A4 American letter size paper. Alright, so first off, with the pen to hand, I'm going to draw in the baseline of the doorway. Remember, it had this bit of a slope to it. Using the pen on this angle as well, so I get this hit and miss line. I don't want to commit any lines too much yet. And then let's put a centre line in. So I think this is really important to get the centre line of the doorway in. Again, that hit and miss line for now. And then I just want to think about the top of the doorway. So obviously want a little bit of room for the archway. So we'll put the top of the doorway here. Again, similar kind of angle to this one. And I just want to think about the overall proportion of this door frame. You can look at an angle and measure that angle and then do the same on your reference, either your photo or if you're working from life. But I don't think it's that important and it's that crucial to get that level of accuracy. So just looking at a shape that is roughly similar to what you see in front of you. So it's about that. I think maybe mine needs to be a little bit taller and a bit slimmer. So look, even though I'm working in pen, I'm not worried about these extra lines. I'm sure I can make use of those for the door frame. And now let's look at some of the big shapes. So I'm just going to split it up into the shapes that I can see. So just a line for that top bit there. And then if we look at the, the padlock, that's around about halfway up, isn't it? That's the halfway point is about the padlock. So the door handle is here, which means the bottom of the windows, I would say, they're around about here. And then let's just look at the thickness between these two windows, these kind of windows with the mesh wire on. So just looking at the thickness of the frame in between, draw some verticals for that. And look, my verticals are not particularly straight, which is absolutely fine for a sketch of this nature. And then we've got this panel in the middle here with a little bit of kind of wood or something at the bottom. We've got one here. So I'm just putting in these quite light and quite quick, just until I'm happy that I've roughly mapped everything out in about the right place. There we go, and then we got this door frame down here. And then we've got a little window in the top there. One in the middle. The third one. So I think that's roughly about right. Maybe it needs to be a little bit taller and slimmer, but it's not far off. And so now that I've put those in, I can start to use heavier lines just to put them in with a bit more strength and clarity. And I want to think about weight of line here. So rather than just trying to draw a nice, neat, strong and thick line at the along the edge of one of these straight edges, one of these verticals, I can just have a quick glance and quick look and see how in some areas there's a bit more shadow and in other areas it disappears. So up here it just seems to be a little bit darker, and then it goes a bit lighter, and then there's a bit of a kind of a chip away from the wood a little bit further down here. So I can just ever so quickly vary the strength of line. And all this does is just adds a little bit more character, a bit more energy to your sketch, just very, very simply, very quickly. So this top frame here, I can put that in as quite a strong line because I can see that everything underneath it is shadow. And then I've got the thickness of the frame down the outside. So again, just varying the weight of that line. A bit darker around the bottom where we've got this, where all the paint has disappeared and we've got this darker wood. And then take that one a bit higher. Again, that's a strong line because it's shadow. I've got this little rock in the bottom here. Let's put that in. It's a nice little feature. It's going to help to break up some of the colour of the blue. There we go. So you can see, just as an example for this little panel, I've done a thicker line at the top and then a dark line but thinner than this top one here, and then a really light hit and miss line on this side. Okay, we're just looking at these windows at the top. Let's put these in nice and quickly. There's a really strong shadow area here, so we can come back and add those. And remember to think of this as a sketch, so it's not an outline drawing for a watercolour. It's an ink sketch in and of its own right that we're going to add a little splash of colour to over the top, and that will help you to just think about how much shading detail with the pen that you want to put in. So you don't want lots of shading, but you want enough that it could potentially stand up on its own as a pen drawing. Now these two windows here, the mesh on these windows, it's obviously kind of a white metal, isn't it? It's looking quite rusty and old, but it's still a white metal. And the only way I could put those in that white is by reserving the space and negatively drawing all the diamond shapes in between them. Obviously, I don't have anywhere near enough time to do that, so I'm just going to put them in with the black pen and just accept, I'm just giving an impression of them. No, they're not going to be in white, they're going to be in black. And then we've got this lock, so this I want to get in as a nice little detail. Just putting it in very, very simply. Definitely want to get the door handle in. We can put a nice bit of kind of yellow in for that. That'll be a nice contrast to the blue. Okay, and then let's just put these details in. So a couple of little rectangles there, and then we've got this little pattern in the middle. So just putting those in, very rough and ready, very simple. And then there's the dark door frame inside, the dark window, I should say, inside. And then for this mesh, I'm just simply going to do some diagonal lines across the whole thing. Where this darker wood is, let's put a little bit of the wood lines in there. Some nice strong shadows around this rock. And then all the paintwork is coming off here, so let's put some texture in to represent that. All right, and then to deal with this archway, let's just take a few little dots there for the center line, and that will just help me create a bit more symmetry. So I can just look at this shape and get it to roughly look like the shape on the right. So the left and right wedge shapes, aren't they? They're kind of a wedge shape, just look the same. And then we'll take that through to, where's it go to? About there, isn't it? And then we've got this vertical line down here, and then this one too. Doesn't matter if these aren't straight because the brickwork is so old and damaged. And then we've got, if you remember, a little bit of the thickness showing through. That might be a bit wide. A little bit of the thickness of this column here is showing. And then we can just put this is a really sort of higgledy-piggledy line. Let's put that in. And then I'm not going to count the bricks, I'm just going to split them up very roughly. But this here is this sharp angle. This is the perspective I was talking about earlier. So sharp angle, slightly less. I'm not measuring this with the pen. I'm just giving an impression of how it starts steep and then gradually becomes more horizontal. This one will be pointing down. And then there's just a width that we can see, very thin slither almost of this archway. And then that's the top of the archway. So that's a heavier line because I can just see a little bit more shadow around there. So I'm just using a bit more pressure on the pen. And let's just strengthen this line in various areas so it looks really dark shadow there. Then we just take that across. So now this is where I'm starting to get looser around the periphery. I'm getting less careful with the mark making. You know, all over I've been relatively quick and sketchy, but these areas around here now are going to get really quick. Let's just put a little something in for the doorstep. So just again looking at some of these little angles here, you don't want them to be off by too much. You can get away with them being a little bit sloppy, but not too much. And then this is a dark area here. I'm going to put some hatching in for that, really dark into the corner there. A little detail here with some of the renderers chipped off. Just want to show that that is in shadow compared to this face here. This is in shadow. Really quick shading. And we got a little bit of shadow just here. A little bit on this outer edge. Front of these steps probably is much to do with the little bits of grass that's growing, but they're darker than the top of the step. So just putting a little bit of tone on to represent that. And then we've got this area here of rendering. It's really scruffy, so just really letting the pen do the work. Lots of jaggedy edges, and then that's just put a very loose representation of some bricks in. So a few little rocks, nice and quick and jagged. Strengthening the marks in some places, letting the pen just kind of hit and miss the surface in others. Got cracks going on, all kinds of really nice texture. You could really spend a long time on a study like this and really get stuck into it. Would be great with acrylics or pastels. I could see myself doing this in colour pencils as well. Same on this side, so stronger lines in places, hit and miss in others. some big rocks, small rocks. I'm not paying any attention at all to specific rocks and where they are. I'm just getting a sense of what's there and just trying to put something in quite quick. Okay, and then I just want to give a sense of some kind of bricks and stuff going on there. And remember, it was a steeper angle here, and then gradually the angle lessened to become more vertical here. So a flatter angle, I should say. And then, again, I'm not going to measure this. I'm just going to give a really rough idea. And then we can just put just a hint of individual cobbles and bricks in. Maybe strengthen one or two of them. So the idea is just not to make it look too uniform. So just adding the last little kind of few touches of shading. I think this will do for the sketch now. Hopefully you can see it's more than an outline for a watercolour. You know, we've put quite a bit of hatching in there and textural marks. So it's more than an outline for a watercolour, but I'm not trying to fill every single area. I want to leave some of the white of the paper just to add a splash of colour. So that's the kind of level of ink work that you want to be thinking about. A sketch in its own right, but enough white paper to add some colour. Onto the watercolour then. So let's start with the blue of the door. We've got a Prussian blue here, cooler blue. And I'm not looking for an exact colour match, obviously, but I'm just going to warm that up ever so slightly. So that is a little bit of the ultramarine blue in there. Let's just touch that on, see what it looks like. That's okay. I think that'll do. Maybe a touch more ultramarine. And let's just add a nice splash of colour. It's okay to leave a little bit of the white of the paper to show through. And you can help yourself do that by just painting in these individual panels. Sometimes it's quite nice if you get little kind of white, thin white lines of the paper just showing through between panels. Just helps to separate all of the different features of the door a little bit more easily. And then just for a bit of fun, let's just add maybe a little bit of red into that. And just drop some of that into the darker areas. Alright, and then I'm going to add some of the brown, the burnt sienna, just to create a kind of a greyer, dirtier version of this blue. And then we could use this as well for these windows. The ones at the top are a little bit lighter, aren't they? They're not that dark. And I'm just going to get the brush a bit cleaner, because what I'm thinking we could do is maybe just add a bit more of a purpley shadow into those top windows. Again, I don't know how it's going to turn out. I'm just experimenting. I'm doing something that, first thing that comes to mind really. And then a real kind of light wash of, you just make a bit of a grey. So I'm just taking the excess off onto the paper towel, and then maybe just a light version of this purpley grey. I want it lighter than that. There we go, just for the outer edges of the windows. some yellow. Touch it into the door handle there. Nice little bit of colour. And let's mix up a sort of a neutral grey. So I'm going to take the yellow. This is the cadmium yellow. So remember to make any kind of neutral grey colour. 3 primary colours. Yellow, red and blue. And whichever of those colours, yellow, red and blue, is stronger, that's going to determine whether it's a blue grey, a reddish grey, a yellow grey. So I'm thinking I want something that's a little bit more of a yellow grey. I want it quite light as well. Loads of water. And you can squeeze the brush, the pen brush, as you're working onto the paper. That'll typically put more colour onto it as well. That's in the fibres of the brush. So that area there, I just want to leave that a little bit lighter, that front face. Got a bit darker in this side. And then while it's quite wet, let's see if we can just add a little splash of colour here and there. And I'm just going overboard, obviously, compared to what's on the reference, just to see if it works, just to see how it looks. Bit of blue as well, maybe. So I don't want too much on. I'm a little touch of green, but I don't want too much colour in the periphery. It's just a hint. Some greens around the bottom, haven't we? And lots of green into here as well. I'm not going to do any more on it than that. Does it work? I'm not so sure with the watercolour. Not being a watercolourist, I make a better job of it in pastels or colour pencils, and I do think it could work with those other mediums for me anyway. As a composition, it's got a nice strong focal point. Doorways always work compositionally anyway, and I think with some nice colours around the outer edges, maybe a bit more subtle than what I've done them, if I was doing pastels or colour pencils, I think this could make a really nice piece of art. So we'll come back to it later on when the others are done. It will have dried fully then as well, so the colours may be a little bit more muted then as well. But have a go with that one. Doorways are always a lot of fun, and let's now move on to sketch number 4.